Chapter 4. So Many Orphans, So Little Time. When Miss Johnson first took over, the students attended the elementary school next door, but other students teased and harassed them mercilessly for being so poor and having so little. Miss Johnson had been an elementary teacher before coming to the home, so she began to teach the younger children right in the home. Each year this became harder for Miss Johnson. She would have given it up years earlier if not for the complications Eliza brought to the home. After 8th grade, the orphans attended regular school, in part because Miss Johnson was already so busy, and in part to prepare them for a world that's often harsh. This made much work for Miss Johnson during the week, and for the older children as well, whom she frequently enlisted to help with everything from wiping noses and bottoms to helping work arithmetic problems and listening to reading. Several of the older students liked to mutter a lot about it along the way. Saturday was the only day Miss Johnson didn't need to maintain a rigid schedule, and Johnny didn't have to run from school to one job after another to the orphanage and back again. Still, Saturdays were hardly a day of rest for anyone. There was still much to do in the home. Lunch had just finished, so Johnny was directing the cleanup routine. The children had each carted their own place settings out to the kitchen, the younger ones getting a little help, of course. "Clarabelle, dear," Johnny asked, "can you please take the empty pickle bowl to the kitchen?" He caught each one as they passed back through the dining room. "That's a good girl." It was Johnny's duty to remind the children that the table wasn't cleared until all the empty serving containers made it to the kitchen as well. "Terrence, please wrap up the extra rolls and carry them to the pantry. Then they'll stay fresh until dinner. I know how you hate hard bread." Johnny continued, "Josie Sue, help Sarah with that pitcher of milk before she ends up wearing it." Sarah protested. "I don't want help. I'm big enough to do it myself." "Yes, Sarah, I know you want to do it alone, but that's a heavy load of milk for a second grader." To this, Sarah wrinkled her nose, but permitted Josie to help her. Johnny took no notice of the face the little girl made and addressed Josie, who he felt sure was about to protest at any moment. "Thank you, Josie Sue. We really appreciate your help around here," though of all the children, Josie needed the most reminding. Johnny was busy with cleaning the table as he passed along gentle orders. He noticed 2 children heading upstairs, while trying a little too hard to look inconspicuous. He figured they were sneaking away from dish duty and was about to go grab them. Suddenly, there came the unmistakable shrill sound of porcelain screeching together, and he expected to hear a crash any moment. Turning around, Johnny caught 2 boys with a very haphazard stack of bowls and plates. They were not stacked right, and the stack was too heavy for even both together. The boys stumbled to the left, and the top of the pile swung to the right. Johnny raced around the table as quickly as he could, winding and weaving between the other children. The boys moved to the right to try catching up with their stack, but the stack shifted left. Other children began to raise a ruckus, offering contradictory advice. Miss Johnson rushed out of the kitchen to investigate, but from the other side of the room she could only watch. Miss Johnson blurted, "Hurry, Johnny! Grab them! We can't afford to lose any more china!" The boys began trying to move the stack back to the table, first moving this way and then rushing that way, trying to keep the balance. Suddenly they zigged when they should have zagged, and the stack tumbled forward. Johnny dove and caught the very top of the stack against his chest as it toppled. The boys grabbed at what they still had, and only 1 plate clattered to the ground. Several other children helped Johnny empty his arms before any more damage could happen. Miss Johnson made her way over to the disaster area to assess the damage. In the mayhem, only 1 bowl suffered what Miss Johnson regarded as a minor nick. Miss Johnson made her displeased sound and added, "What were the 2 of you thinking? How many times do I have to tell you that trying to rush things always makes more work in the end?" Christine came out of the kitchen and asked, "Now where have Tricia and Michael gotten off to so quickly? The dishes are piled high and won't wait for a good cleaning." The children took rotations to wash the Saturday dishes, and this week it fell to the 2 6th graders. It was customary for the children to try and conveniently forget their duty, but none ever succeeded. "I'll grab them for you, ma'am." Johnny turned to run up the stairs. "Wait, Johnny," Miss Johnson stopped him. "These 2 are going to be on dish duty for a month as payment for their hurrying. We barely have what we need, and there's no room in the budget to replace anything." Johnny returned to surveying the table, including looking underneath, and saw everything was in order. With the day being so nice, the children donned their jackets and slipped into the backyard for some playtime. Johnny grabbed his coat and followed suit. Of all the jobs he had to do, cleanup was the most dreaded, but he learned to stick to it and get it done. With Johnny monitoring the children, they were able to slip over to the school playground. The only area that was off limits was the old barn, whether Johnny was watching them or not. The barn gave the children the creeps because it was so old and rickety. It made strange moaning and groaning sounds as the wind pushed its frame back and forth and whistled between the loose boards. Elizabeth received an extra dose of special attention on Saturdays. In addition, someone had to save the other little girls from the tyranny of Alice, who chose to lead as a benevolent dictator, but tended to overdo it. Besides, as a child ruler, she led a difficult life and needed the break to take time to be a child herself. Johnny often forgot that this applied to himself as well. Thomas was the leader of the younger boys, and he chose a more communistic route. Everything the boys had was his, and he made sure that everyone got their fair share of everything. This meant he kept the best and biggest share and doled out a meager ration to the others. On Saturdays, Johnny took time to step into Thomas's domain and redistribute the wealth. Johnny ran back and forth playing games with the children, resolving disputes over marbles and checkers, pushing them on swings, helping with the teeter-totter, spinning the merry-go-round, and monitoring the other equipment. Johnny liked this time the best because he wasn't so much a boss as a co-conspirator, though it gave him quite a workout. As for the older boys, they generally went off by themselves. By that age, the boys were a little better about following the rules in their games and not so many disputes erupted. Even when a scuffle did ensue, they usually worked it out themselves. Sometimes they actually fought and came away with bloody lips, though it never solved anything. When it came to the older girls, Johnny's dealings with them were precarious at best. They spent much time on Saturdays in their room discussing which girls each of the boys in their classes liked best, who the latest couples were, and sharing other details from school, home, and church. Miss Johnson intervened at some point and trained them in some more practical matters they'd need to know as adults. Amidst all the activity, Jason ran over declaring, "Timmy fell in the well!" Johnny, who had been pushing Josie May and Terrence on the swings, immediately stopped and ran after Jason. They ran to the side of the barn where a small extension housed an open well for the cows. Of course, there were no more cows, and the well was boarded over. But like the rest of the barn, the boards were old and split. As they came closer, Johnny could hear the whining protests of little Timmy. "Something is poking me. Stupid boards. My tummy is getting pinched. Somebody, hurry." At that age, even inanimate objects become intentional adversaries. When Johnny looked in the barn, he found Timmy wedged in between the boards up to his stomach. Johnny didn't figure the boy was hurt or he'd have been crying. The gap wasn't large enough for Johnny, so he pried one more board away. Just then, Miss Johnson came jogging over, looking greatly concerned. What in heaven's name was the child doing near the barn? "He was playing catch with me and Sarah Sue. The ball slipped into the barn through the cracks," Elizabeth explained. "I yelled, 'Wait, get Johnny,' but he went after it anyhow. I heard a loud crack and then he shrieked." "That's when I came to see," Sarah Sue added. "Jason went to go get Johnny and I ran to get you." Miss Johnson permitted them to continue rambling on with explanations, now that she could see that Timmy wasn't in any immediate danger or greatly injured. Johnny got the boards loose and entered the small room. He slipped on the loose dirt floor but caught himself on an old wooden barrel. The well itself was only about 2 adult steps across, with a short wall of stones around the outside. Several partly rotten boards were lying across this border. Johnny grasped Timmy with one arm while he pried at the boards that had caught the child. In a moment he was loose, and Johnny passed him out to Miss Johnson. Miss Johnson carried Timmy to the house, inspecting the tear on one pant leg. He had another patch, but thank goodness that's all. As Johnny exited the well room, he saw everyone gathered around to see what was going on. He shooed them away with a motion of his arm, and they all returned to their earlier activities. "Elizabeth and Sarah Sue, please don't play catch so close to the barn next time." "But I didn't," Eliza began to protest. "Shh, child," Johnny said as he ruffled her hair. "I'm not blaming you, just offering some helpful advice for next time. Come, there are a couple empty swings at the playground." At this point, he returned to pushing swings. Fortunately, nothing else particularly exciting or unusual happened during playtime. With this uproar in the middle, nap time came quickly. There were many tired children as they ran off whatever immediate energy they'd gotten from lunch. Christine came out to ring the bell, but many children saw her and began heading in before the first ring. Johnny helped Miss Johnson and Christine put all the kids down for a nap. He peeked in the girls' room to make sure they were all asleep and not into mischief. He tiptoed to the side of Eliza's bed and saw her eyes closed. As he carefully pulled the sheets up to her chin, she opened her eyes and looked up at him. Once again, Johnny lightly traced the scar with his thumb and whispered, "Shh, Eliza. Sleep well. I'll be back later this afternoon." She said nothing, but merely curled up against the wall. A thin smile crossed her face as she turned away. Then Johnny was on his way to Pastor Stephen's home, in the parsonage next to the church. This was the only Saturday activity Johnny made room for outside of the orphanage. In fact, Miss Johnson insisted he do it. He went nearly every Saturday afternoon to help with various tasks around the parsonage and the church. Pastor Stevens had been mentoring Johnny for several years, so they spent a good deal of time talking about growing up, responsibilities, setting priorities, and other character issues. It also gave Johnny a chance to vent when all the busyness of his life inevitably led to frustration. It was a particularly pleasant day with a light breeze. Ordinarily, it was about a 10-minute walk to Pastor Stevens' home. 15 minutes on days like today, when Johnny was in the mood to reflect upon recent events or daydream about the future. Johnny knocked at Pastor Stevens' side door and waited. He could hear some discussion between the pastor and his wife, but couldn't make out what they were saying. The pastor opened the door mid-sentence. "Then we could put it in the bay window." "Good morning, Johnny. Please come in." "But that means moving some of the other plants somewhere else." Johnny immediately understood that the pastor's wife had gotten a desire to rearrange the furniture again. The problem was too many pieces of furniture for such a small house. She always had Johnny and her husband try all sorts of things, but in the end, it was hardly different from the beginning. The pastor gave up pointing this out to his wife. Johnny just helped him patiently perform her orders until she was content. Johnny saw that in the end, the process seemed to be more important to her than the actual results. The most impatient thing the pastor had ever said was, "We tried this last time, but I'll move the very foundations of the house if it makes you happy, my love." Today, the wife was only concerned with the living room. A woman from the church gave them a large metal plant stand. After looking at the plant stand, Johnny suggested, "I think it would look splendid on the porch, just in front of your bay window where you could still see it from inside." The pastor replied, "That was my first suggestion also, but it was vetoed." The wife explained, "With all the spring rain that's coming, I'm afraid it'll be turned into rust in no time." After about 30 minutes, they found a configuration that made the wife happy. The smaller plant stands that presently inhabited the bay window were far easier to squeeze into other spots, but the large window space was the only place suitable for the larger stand. Johnny and Pastor Stevens drank the customary glass of lemonade on the porch with Mrs. Stevens, and then it was time to take care of the church grounds. The pastor reached up and touched his wife's cheek, keeping his hand there until she was beyond arm's reach. Johnny always thought it seemed the pastor could hardly bear to be apart from her. During the brief walk across the yard, the pastor asked, "So any exciting news from the orphanage?" "Well," Johnny recalled, "Timmy almost took a tumble into the well in the barn, but he got caught up on some wood. He escaped unhurt, but his pants were not so fortunate." "That could have turned out really bad," the pastor observed. "We need to round up a few guys from the congregation to go over and fill that well. I can come over next Saturday for a switch in the routine. Does that work for you?" As Johnny nodded yes, he gave a chuckle. Work teams were always himself, the pastor, and Joel Samuels, the high school math teacher. That suited Johnny fine. Both men provided most of the moral support for his busy life. The work time always included serious discussion about life and a fair amount of horseplay. They started at the flower beds beside the front entrance to the foyer. They began to clear away the leaf piles that protected the bulbs from the winter cold. Johnny always worked hard and still managed to get in quite a lot of discussion with the pastor, but today the pastor thought Johnny seemed unusually quiet. "Johnny," he finally asked, "anything else happen at the orphanage this week worth noting? You sure do seem to have something mulling over in your head today. I'm figuring it must be something with Elizabeth." Johnny sighed before answering. "She snuck out early this morning trying to get to Old Miller Park. That's the biggest scare she's given me yet." Pastor started. "Miller Park? But that would take her near—" "The house," Johnny interrupted, "which is where I found her, frozen stiff looking at it, almost like she knew or sensed something. You don't suppose—" "Nah," Pastor assured him. "At her age, the look of the thing was enough to get her going." "What did you tell her? Anything?" "Nope, just hurried her on home, but she asked. You gotta know she was curious as anything about it." "I can imagine she was. Wow, that far from the home. You must have been just about coming out of your skin. I sure hope nothing comes of it." Pastor let the topic rest for a moment as they finished with the flower bed on the left. When they switched over to the right side, Pastor thought it best to get started again without too much delay. Johnny was going to need some help digesting the emotion of it all. Finally, the pastor asked, "So, Mr. Stewart, tell me, what's still going through that mind of yours?" "Anybody could have seen her this morning. If the word gets out to the wrong people that there's a black girl over at the orphanage, who knows what could happen? Maybe nothing, but when they find out how old she is, maybe someone will piece it together." They finished at the front and began to walk back to the baseball diamond. As they walked, the pastor scolded, "You really need to learn to let go of these things, you know. Today has enough trouble of its own without worrying about tomorrow as well. You can't undo what happened this morning just by thinking about it. Pray about it, of course, but then let it go. You know there's more to it than that. I've always known sooner or later she'll be discovered, so that's nothing new. You know, it's more the past that's getting to me right now. Being on that street again and seeing the house must have been quite a shock to you after all these years. I bet it brought back some memories, didn't it?" "Yes, it sure did. And what memories." "That's not really the problem, though. I'm feeling regret, wondering why I had to be there and thinking how complicated my life has become." "I think I understand what's really going on deep down in the heart of Johnny," the pastor mused. "I think you're being bothered by the guilt for thinking such things." Johnny stopped working and looked at the pastor. After a moment, he said, "Shouldn't I? You know very well how things would have turned out if I weren't there. How can I possibly be thinking such things?" "Don't beat yourself up too much. You do way too much of that, my young friend. You're just wishing things hadn't turned out as they have. Not that there would not have been a good resolution, but just one that did not have to involve you." It was getting late, and progress was slow as it became more of a counseling session. The pastor took Johnny into his study to look at a few verses the pastor thought might help. Johnny headed for home around 4 in the afternoon, and by then he was quite tired. He knew Elizabeth would be waiting for him on the porch, wanting to know why he was so late in returning. As Johnny came in the door, he wondered, what am I going to say to her after all this? Miss Johnson held the phone between her shoulder and her ear as she ruffled through a pile of papers spread out before her. "All I know is what I was told. Miss Calder told me the mortgage was paid off several years before I came, but I can't find any documentation to that fact." She nodded her head several times as she listened. "Well, I will keep searching, but I don't know where else I might look." Looking up, she saw Johnny standing at the door to the office. Johnny was concerned. He'd never seen her look so discouraged before. She asked, "How long have you been listening there at the door?" "Long enough, Miss Johnson. Is the home in serious trouble?" She looked thoughtful for a moment and responded, "Johnny, come in and please close the door behind you. This home's like a cornfield. So many ears, you know." "What is the matter, ma'am?" "Well, you remember that letter you gave me earlier today. The mayor is claiming the home's mortgage still has a balance. Now they want us to pay the mortgage and fines to the city on top of that. The home can't afford that. I know when I took over the home many years ago I was told the mortgage was taken care of, but I can't find any record." "What will happen if we can't pay? Will the home need to close? Where will we go? Slow down, Johnny. I don't know the answer to those questions, but I'm still hoping and praying it's just some mistake. You can help us all out by remembering this problem when you say your prayers. God's hands are the best place to leave it. Johnny gave a brief chuckle, then commented, So I've heard. In fact, just a couple of moments ago from Pastor Stevens.